what I'm going to explore today is the concept we've been developing at Atkins for the last few years, which we're calling environmental integrated design. And this is our proactive outcome-based approach for environmental assessment powered by digital and data. So a brief introduction of myself. My name is Paul Morgalla. I'm a principal consultant at Atkins, and I'm our UK environment lead. And I'm an expert in environmental management, information management, digital transformation. I've been in the industry for about 17 years, and for the first 12 years, I worked on many sort of flood risk and water resource management projects, both in the UK and overseas. So impact assessment is very close to my heart. I'm currently project manager for an internal digital transformation program called Pangea, which is looking at sort of transforming our environmental services. And a core component of Pangea is what I'd like to talk about you today. So you can contact me either in the chat window, or you can send me an email or connect me on LinkedIn. So if I asked you what is digital IA, what sort of thoughts sort of initially spring to mind? I think for many, we initially think of digital reporting, and a lot of sort of what's been reported in the media and the press and talked about publicly is really about sort of creating website versions of environmental assessment reports. These are often converting sort of environmental statements into something a bit more engaging. There's been many examples, and indeed Atkins developed its own reporting. The example you see on the screen there was an EIA for University of Cambridge, which combined sort of video and mapping and infographics to create sort of better versions of sort of old paper-based reports. And I think they really do help in communicating the complexities of EIA to stakeholders. And one day they may become the path for 100% digital submissions. And I know there's been sort of examples of this piloted in recent years. But I don't believe alone this will bring the revolution that we hoped for in applying sort of digital technology to the same old ways of doing things. It's kind of like sprinkling digital glitter on a report, so to speak, rather than truly transforming the delivery and the outcomes of projects. So what we need to do is challenge ourselves to really sort of think differently. And the questions I want us to ask ourselves is digital IA today really driving efficiency and proportionality in environmental assessment? Is the benefits of are the benefits of digital IA sort of helping sort of non-EIAs as well? There's an enormous amount of development that we have in this country every year. We build every year, but doesn't get the same attention as sort of statutory EIAs. And is digital just reinforcing that sort of two-tier approach? And then finally, let's get back to why we do impact assessment in the first place. It's to make development more sustainable and designs more consentable. So is digital IA and digital reporting really helping to achieve this? And I think my answer to that at the moment is no. So it's those sort of questions which have helped us sort of develop what we're calling environmental integrated design. Traditionally, and I'm sure you've all been here before, sort of environments often sort of comes to the table sort of quite late. We're only really considered once the design process has really started. The lines have already been drawn, and we're coming late to a party which is complex, multi-stakeholder delivery and consenting process. It's very reactive and very often quite a negative process. So what happens is we assess the design, we identify the baseline, we assign values to different receptors, and then we undertake a whole load of work to identify and quantify the impacts. We then get caught in this vicious loop of reactive and iterative design and abortive efforts. Environment experts highlight the issues, and then design teams try to mitigate the worst impacts of the design. And this can go on for a long time. The approach can be very siloed, it's precautionary, and it's mainly focused on damage limitation. This approach is traditionally sort of document-led as well, and our intelligence is often locked in inaccessible reports and not in the hands of decision makers or stakeholders. It makes the going slow. Stakeholders struggle to manage document versions, to analyze them, and to really sort of prioritize what's important. So at Atkins, we've started to develop an alternative to this, and one which is an outcome-based, underpinned by technical evidence. It's a proactive approach centered around engaging earlier in the delivery process to inform the solution. Environmental integrated design seeks to avoid the impacts and reduce the impacts as early as possible in the process, long before design gets too advanced and it's too late to influence. The initial step is to set the environmental requirements into design principles prior to design. And we're starting to see this on some projects, but it's certainly not something which is throughout. By setting out performance of what environmental incomes we want that design to meet. So that could be, for example, achieving biodiversity net gain, enhancing air quality or reducing flood risk, and there's plenty more. We can then understand our baseline, compare it against future baselines to drive those positive outcomes rather than reacting to just what's on the page. Also, by coming to the design process at an earlier stage, we might not have all the detailed answers yet, but we can start asking smarter questions. So in short, we can improve the conversation between environment and design so we can focus on avoiding the greatest impacts, earlier sight of reducing the ones we can't, and switch to a more positive, proactive conversation focused on identifying those opportunities. I think this also brings enormous benefits in terms of if we can just reduce one of those design cycles, if we can reduce a number of those mitigations that we apply to schemes, then we can lower the design and construction costs. And more importantly, we can shift that focus from mitigating the worst to achieving the environmental outcomes that we set out from the start. So what does sort of digital and data play a role in this? It's really difficult to have informed conversations with our stakeholders if we don't have the information in the first place. So the earlier we can access data, the earlier and the better we can engage in the process. We're now moving to a world where instant access to much of the baseline data we need. Yes, we still need to undertake surveys and measurements, etc. But the open data revolution over the last 10 years means that we can get out the starting blocks early. Here in Atkins, we developed digital tools that allows our environment staff, any of our environmental staff, to gather data from 60-odd sort of open data sets of environmental receptors on any site in the UK in under 10 minutes. Only a few years ago, that would have taken us days, and now it just takes a few clicks of the buttons. I think we're also finally starting to go through what is the environment version of the BIM revolution. Our engineers who have been for the last 10 years sort of evolved into sort of building 3D models rather than creating paper drawings. As we tend to work in GIS rather than CAD, we've developed a spatial common data environment to collate and access data stores centrally. So when we need a map or we need to undertake some analysis, we cut the data from the model rather than create that work individually. So examples of this, such as the one on the screen here, is a spatial CDE we set up for the design and the EIA for Havant Thicket Reservoir in Portsmouth Water, where all the information is stored in a single location where all the stakeholders can access. To be a true common data environment, we've gone beyond creating a sort of a bucket of storing unmanaged data to one which is a more managed process, aligned with the BIM standards, that's ISO 19650, where data is managed throughout the project life and it grows in maturity. And also we have that very clear audit trail all the way back to the source. So we can exactly see what decisions were made when and link them back to when they happened. Systems are also becoming more integrated. So that means that data is available to all stakeholders, not just the environment and design teams and the contractors, but also the client, the regulators, planning officials, members of the public. We can visualize the data in web GISs, like the example on the screen there, or we can load that same data into into desktop software to analyze CAD, GIS, etc., to then do sort of further analysis. And then finally, we're starting to apply automation and data analytics as well to that environmental data. So we can start to sift and prioritize from what can feel like an enormous amount of ever increasing data. We can start to use data to start asking those so what questions. So for example, can the presence of a particular receptor be linked to a particular activity, such as survey or report? With data at the center of assessment, rather than the technical detail being buried into reports, we can gain better insight from the project. The overall assessment and consenting process is more responsive. It allows us to provide a consistency of approach, transparency, that audit trail, which makes evidencing and reporting of data easier and allows the design information to be shared quickly and consistently. And I think for many of us, it creates a more collaborative working. It breaks down a number of those silos that we all suffer from. And it allows that visibility of data, both between environmental disciplines and then across wider stakeholders. So that's quite a bit of theory there. So what does sort of environmental integrated design look like in practice? We just kind of got time for one example. And the one I'm going to do is it was the central section of East-West Rail. So for those who don't know, it's a project that's linking Oxford and Cambridge via a new railway. And it's a really great piece of work that's being led by two fantastic, one current and one ex-colleague, Fran and Fiona. And it really just shows that by engaging earlier, we can integrate design, we can integrate environment into design side from the beginning to achieve better outcomes. It's also worth saying that this piece of work also led to an ESRI Insight Award in 2020. So the project started off by setting out those environmental objectives and outcomes early in the project. So for each of the topics, setting out what do they want to achieve. The baseline data is then rapidly gathered and held in a spatial CDE, and you can see the sort of smorgasbord of different receptors on the map in the top corner there. And instead, that takes a matter of moments now, rather than weeks to sort of collect that initial data. Prior to development of the specific routes, the environment team worked very closely with the client and the design teams and other stakeholders to develop these route corridors. And then we combine those route corridors with environment data to identify the receptors where we'd want to avoid at all possible. For the remaining receptors, we undertook a sort of a data-driven assessment to a certain sort of level of mitigation required for different receptor types. And then finally, undertook a RAG assessment for each of the route corridors against the original environmental objectives to identify whether the corridor would have an adverse or positive effect against each of those objectives, both during the construction and the operational and maintenance phase. This means that environmental concerns can be considered from day one before any of the design work can commence. And while we accept we don't have all the information to hand at this early stage, it starts the design process off the right foot and makes everyone in the team aware of some of those biggest challenges that the scheme faces. It focuses the attention on what we need to avoid, early sight of what we can't, and a lot more proactive conversation around the opportunities for delivering environmental compliance, sort of beyond environmental compliance outcome. But can we go further? And I think so. And I think the catalyst for this is the use of sort of data, digital, and technology, which we can use to really accelerate the process, to increase that collaboration, drive those efficiencies, maintain that high level of quality, but ultimately just provide better decision making at the fingertips of stakeholders. And we can first of all do this by creating a central data model for managing the assessment. So we can go beyond just capturing that data in a single place, that common spatial environment. That's a good start, but we need to go one step further. And I think the next step really is start developing what we can call this sort of receptor digital twin. So in non-geek speak, a digital twin is really just a digital representation of those environmental assets that we believe are on the ground. Digital twin is a sort of a buzzword at the moment in the sort of engineering and construction world. And I think one of the missing components is the environmental aspect of how our environmental aspects are interacting with our asset. For each of those assets, we can give a unique ID. And that means when different sort of topic experts are referring to the same receptors, we can then quickly identify the cumulative effects on each. With the data in a single model, we can then start applying that sort of data analytics. We can start to sift and prioritize and identify activities that need to be done. And I think we go one step further, we can start to develop sort of pre-mitigate solutions based on what we know is there. We already know what many of these sort of mitigations are. We can directly link them to the types of receptors that we have and start to form on what that solution might be. Then our environmental experts across the range of sort of topics and disciplines use the data in the model to form their baseline and undertake their assessment. But rather sort of fragmenting their findings into sort of document silos, they feed their outcomes of their assessment back into the receptor model. So this means we can view the data in real time and start to track progress throughout the project. We also need to improve the integration between the CAD asset model and the GIS receptor model. And so design and construction engineers can see and understand environmental information in the language that they need to see it in. And likewise, environmental experts can see the latest scheme information. Once we got that, we can start to then track and map the impacts of design changes and construction changes on the receptor model throughout dashboards, start showing how few receptors at risk, and then making sure that during construction phase that those changes and monitoring of those changes are actually put in place. And then finally, where we do need outputs, and we always will, when we need reports, maps, tables, information going into consultation platforms, then we can cut that from the single source. So no longer will stakeholders have to sort of thumb through a huge doorstep-sized environmental statement to be able to get the information they need. So let's take a simple example of a pond. You know, if you're a contractor, you want to know what control measures for your works for the works around that pond. But if you're the regulator like Natural England, you want to know what license measures and species information is at that pond. Or if you're a member of the public, you want to know whether that local pond, which perhaps you enjoy seeing on a weekend walk on every week, won't be affected by the scheme. So we can start to tailor the information to meet the needs and the answer specific questions, which we couldn't do previously because it was all locked in a sort of linear fashion in reports. It's worth saying that like many of these components do kind of exist in their component parts, and it's how we start bringing them together and applying them, I think, is the sort of the next stages. But I think as an industry, we also need to look at how we standardize them as well, and also lower the cost barrier. This can't be just technology for the few, it has to be technology for the many. How do we make this more accessible, not just to those large statutory EIAs, which have the budget to be able to sort of do things and make the same sort of technologies that can be appropriately applied to sort of the smallest schemes and organizations as well. So before I finish up, I just wanted to sell out what we think we can do to start making this a reality. First of all, I highly recommend you have a look at a publication by Michael Batty and Wei Yang if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. It came out a couple of months ago in February, and they set out a vision for digital transformation in the spatial planning in the UK, and they also included impact assessment as well. And they have some real clear recommendations of some industry level changes we need to make. So rather than represent their findings, you can just go and read them in the report. It's very well set out. I thought I'd focus on some simple steps you can do as that you as practitioners can take. I think first of all, we just have to shout louder and give environment a voice. But we're now in the stage of reality where the world is accepting the importance of the environment as an asset, and we need to get engaged earlier and fight for a seat at the table. And I encourage you all to do that within your roles. Also think about how you collaborate with other stakeholders outside of your specialism. Think about how you can improve the sharing of data and information, the languages you use to talk to other stakeholders, and really understand is, are you communicating well? Are you sharing the right information to each other? If you're a custodian of environmental information, highly encourage you to continue to look ways to make that more available. Can you make more information, more environmental data available available in an open format and under an open data license, so we can get we can bring that information into more environmental assessments. And if you're a data user, let organizations know about what opening data sort of brings in positives and benefits. How sort of opening that data can create opportunities for those organizations to get into sort of schemes earlier. I think we need to continue to invest in scalable tools and technologies that support our work. And when I mean scale, I mean downscale. So we continue to see lots of sort of big, robust solutions for large statutory EIAs. But we need to continue to look at ways. So how do we make those those same technologies sort of downscale to those small schemes as well? And then finally, sort of a personal ask is upskill yourself. As part of your sort of personal development plans, just make a commitment to learn one new digital or data technique each year. And what I mean by this is not about learning to code. In fact, we don't, there's plenty of coders out there. We don't, as environmental sort of practitioners, necessarily need to learn to code. What would be better is just sort of learning sort of digital and data techniques, like improving your Excel skills or your GIS skills. Get comfortable with looking and reviewing data as well as documents. We're going to move into a world where actually there's going to be less reporting in a sort of a paper format or in a Word document and more data. So are you comfortable in doing so? And if not, what sort of practical steps could you do to start sort of upskilling yourself up to support your role in the future? So that's it for my presentation. More than welcome any questions that you have. I just want to end up sort of just sort of summarizing our sort of takeaways. So first of all, as an industry, I feel we need to stop talking about sort of digital EIA, and in particular, accept that digital reporting alone isn't going to bring a sort of revolution for change. I've talked about Atkins' approach of sort of environmental integrated design, that proactive outcome-based approach, which is focused on getting environment much earlier to the table before the design process has started. We can use data and technology to provide a catalyst for that change, but the reality is that change doesn't happen without us wanting to embrace it. And hopefully there's some practical steps there that you can all adopt. And on that note, I'll end my presentation.
Great, thanks for that, Paul. Like Paul said, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we do have one question. How have clients reacted to environmental integrated design?
I think some answers. I think clients have reacted quite well. There's a number of sort of structural changes we have to do to sort of change this approach, and so some of it is on the client side in terms of just changing the sort of the gateway approach that they go about schemes and making sure that environment gets heard at the right moments. But actually, I think the main conversations that we've had, and a lot of positive conversation we had, has been with design teams to really sort of challenge that traditional way of doing things, and really getting them to think differently. I'm not trying to promote that we are going to take the design away from engineers. I'm not an engineer. I'm not going to play the role of an engineer. But this is really about just getting that earlier insight about what are the big challenges that schemes and developments need to take way before we start developing them.
Great. Another question is, what do you see are the major blockers to the wider adoption of digital technology in environmental markets?
The biggest blockers, I think funding is always a challenge. We're not in a market where we have bags of cash, and so money is always going to be a challenge. This is a highly competitive market that we work in. I think the biggest hurdle we often see and keep coming across is just that behavioural change. It's just accepting the fact for all of us that we need to embrace change for this to happen. So you can put all the best technology in place, but if no one wants to use it, then no one's going to then nothing's going to happen. And so actually it's that behavioural change which is the biggest challenge. So as part of our internal program in Pangaea, yes, we're developing the sort of digital and technology solutions, but about 50% of our budget is actually going in on that behavioural change, supporting training, support, education, and really helping people and helping them sort of make that jump into the new world.
Great. Alicia's asking, how can public access to environmental data be more transparent with stakeholders?
I think it's really key, and we must encourage sort of stakeholder engagement. It really does shape the outcomes of a project when we have that wider group opinions of those who have to going to sit and look at these developments for the rest of their lives. That we incorporate them in. I think getting the right tools to sort of get that information out is sort of quite challenging. But there's a number of platforms out there now where we can sort of demonstrate and show data and information in really sort of simple and effective ways that allow stakeholders to be able to see it. I think the biggest challenge we come across with any sort of stakeholders is we all have different questions to ask and we all speak slightly different language. And so being able to understand what the question is was being asked for that information is key. And then we can then transform and work out what data do we need to be able to sort of extract, to be able to sort of answer that question.
Okay, thank you. One of the main challenges, especially if developing countries, is access to tools, right? Software and data collection. How can we overcome this challenge and improve on this great path to development?
It is, and I think there's a lot of technologies which tend to start in the Western world and then sort of trickle down. But I think things are changing, and I think the embracement of open data is the first one. So just being access to more data available. There's a lot more data available than there certainly was when I started my career, and there's going to be ever more in the future. And a lot of tools are also open source now. There's a lot of open source tools which are free at point of entry. Yes, they require investment and people's time to develop, but there's a lot more tools there which people can access now for free of charge. So, for example, QGIS is one of my favorite bits of software. I used to use a lot of ArcGIS, a lot of Esri software. I don't anymore. I use QGIS. It's just as powerful, and in many ways it's a lot better. But actually, it's free at point of access for people to do. So I think we're moving in the right direction of being able to get some of these technologies to others. But I think that sort of move towards more open source and more sort of standardization of products is going to be the right direction for this.
Thank you. With many agencies having file limitations for incoming emails, etc., will this prove problematic for submitting or sharing files?
So can you repeat the question again, sorry?
With many agencies having file limitations for incoming emails, will this prove problematic for submitting and sharing files?
Well, hopefully we can move away from emails. And the thing with email is it's really bad for sharing documents. It's a really bad format. It wasn't designed for it. So email was only really designed for sharing, snippets of text. I think the move to cloud-based platforms is really starting to change that. So you no longer need to submit things via an email. You can use sort of cloud-based document management systems to sort of share data instead. And I think that's starting to overcome a lot of the sort of barriers that we've certainly seen in the past.
Perfect. And the final question that we have is, what types of tools or software do you use to capture environmental data, and what are the limitations?
So first of all, I've already mentioned one, which is QGIS, which is something we've really embraced. I think a lot of some of the technologies that we've developed and Atkins are sort of proprietary systems, which we've been able to develop because we're a large organization that allows us to do so, which may not be practical for others. But again, we're using underpinning a lot of those technologies is open source solutions. So it's solutions which can be built at a smaller scale to allow these sort of things. I really don't think in the future this should be something for just the big organizations and the big schemes to be able to sort of adopt. It has to be something which is adopted by all.
Great, thank you. That was very interesting. Lots of the comments in the chat agree that it's very insightful and interesting. So that's it from us today. Attendees, thank you for logging in. I hope you found it beneficial and informative.